despite the oppression and being squeezed out of the public sector, they're world citizens. They're plugged into what's going on. They have a curiosity that is sort of never ending, and they can connect anywhere, even though they're locked in their homes in many ways. It's basically liberating, despite the oppression that they have to face on the outside. And one has to wonder, you know, how does that play out in 10 to 20 years? And is the iron hand of the Taliban going to be capable of sustaining itself in this repressive way? And the optimistic part of me says no, it's too much against the human spirit of the time that you're going to be able to keep people in a box like that.
Hi everyone, welcome to another Sherazad Foundation mini podcast. Today I am with someone extraordinary. His name is Tom Freston, and he's best known as the media visionary who co-founded MTV and who worked to build it into a global cultural force. But at the same time, alongside his media career, Tom has developed a profound and lifelong connection with Afghanistan through decades of travel, business, friendships, culture, and support for the Afghan media business. I'm thrilled to bits to have Tom Freston with me today on this Sherazad Foundation mini podcast. So Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here and so appreciative of the work that you're doing.
Oh, look, thank you so much. And, something that I love is that, a bit like me in my life and everyone in our family, I think, Afghanistan has, you've circled back to Afghanistan time and again, just as it has circled back to us in our family. I'm just fascinated by your first steps, maybe the first time you heard the name Afghanistan. Did you know anything about it? Had you grown up knowing about Afghanistan? Where did it stand for you?
I really didn't know much about the country other than where it was. I was sort of a child of the 60s, and I had left an advertising career in New York and embarked on a year-long, sort of wander, walkabout, if you will. And I met a woman in Greece, and she said, well, you know what you need to do? You need to go to India and Afghanistan, and you need to go overland. This was an era when they had this thing called the hippie trail in the early 70s and the mid 70s. And while it was sort of a low level traveling migrants coming out of the 60s and 70s. No one self-identified as a hippie, but if you were a young person traveling, in the US, you would head to a commune if you wanted to sort of drop out. If you lived in Europe, you would head to Morocco or head to India and sort of forsake your Western heritage and try and dive in and be curious. So I got mixed up in this, and I clearly remember my life changing the day I entered Afghanistan. I was looking, and I would ultimately build a business there, as well as one in India, because I wanted to live there, and I was extremely curious. I couldn't believe that all this had been going on the same planet I had been living on for then 25 years and did not know much about it. So I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I found Afghanistan to be extremely hospitable. When I went, it was 1972. So it was the end of what Afghans now would call the golden age. Tahir Shah was still the king. He had yet to be disposed by his cousin. And I just fell in love with the country, with the broad landscapes, with the friendliness of the people, with the sense that I was sort of stepping back in time. In a country that had never been colonized, that had a lot of integrity and dignity. And while it was poor, it was very excited about maybe coming into the modern world. But soon that was all to be derailed. But no one could have imagined that when I arrived.
You can't see this, but if you could, you'd see my arms are covered in goosebumps right now. And I've had shivers down my back listening to what you're saying, because I think what moves me mostly was that was it was almost like a fragment of time that my father, Idris Shah, the writer, Idris Shah, talked about endlessly. When we were kids, he talked about that moment, just maybe through the 60s and very early 70s, when, women were even wearing, pictured in miniskirts in Kabul, and there were I've got them pictures of women and men, university and having educations that would build the new Afghanistan. And sadly, obviously, Afghanistan's been hit time and again by, trial and tribulation. Did you have a sense back then in the early 70s that, did you think this country's going places and it'll be another powerhouse like India, or what were you thinking?
Yeah, the signs of the future were really promising. If you went, there was a big dichotomy then between the city and world, but in Kabul, the elite, which was adopting, I wouldn't say a lot of Western things exactly, but they were tuning into the world. They were aware of what's going on. I remember they were talking about the introduction of television and other things. The universities were booming. And there was a lot of excitement about land reform, still desperately poor, but there was just there was just this charm about the country and the people, and there was almost like an innocence. You never could imagine what was going to happen. In fact, my Afghan partners from my business, when I would say to them, you really should come to New York, which is where I was based, they would say, oh, we can't go to New York. It's too dangerous there. Because in Afghanistan, even though a good number of people looked like tribesmen and they were walking around with like old Enfield rifles on their shoulders, you never ever felt like you were in danger. It's such a there was such a juxtaposition after that, because we've seen now 40 plus years of conflict and a various bunch of wars led by extremists of every stripe. It's been so sad that this would happen to a place like Afghanistan.
Do you mean, thank you. Do you know what I mean when I say, and I mean this with love for Afghanistan, but it's kind of like a medieval country. It's kind of, to me, it's like the Arabian Nights, the Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights. You almost expect the carpet someone sitting on in a tea house to suddenly, with the click of fingers, to be a magic carpet, because it's almost that the whole place is preposterous and incredible and, far-fetched in a lot of ways. Is that how you've
Yeah,
seen
I
it?
mean, I've been walking around. I used to just love getting lost in old Kabul, for example, or old Herat, and I used to think I could be walking in any one of 3 centuries, depending on where I was. And there was no advertising. There was hardly any telephones. You were really in a land without tourists. It was like some fantasia, some Arabist, some Orientalist fantasy in a way. That's how I used to imagine myself. I would think no one would ever find me here. I could really dive in, learn the language, learn local customs, and have a wonderful time. There was something just learning all the time. And then the natural beauty was a whole other element. In Kabul, there was only 400,000 people there then. The
Yeah.
sky was blue. You could see the snows of the Hindu Kush Mountains every day right out your window walking down the street. No traffic. The only traffic was really these Russian Volga cars. But yeah,
And this Afghan thing of Afghans always, I'm just thinking before I say this. Afghans always say to me, you are under my protection. You are under our protection. My family will protect you." In the kind of way that, you read out of, you read it in 1001 Nights, and you read it in romance novels, when the swooning heroine is told by a tall, dark stranger that he will protect her. And actually, my father's mother was Scottish, and in the 1920s, she eloped to Afghanistan, to the Hindu Kush, with my grandfather, and she wrote a book called My Khyber Marriage, which is still in print, and it's rather like a kind of romance novel, because she was just taken by just the romance of everything about Afghanistan. People will give you a flower, and a rose, in the street, or I don't know, you know what I mean? Or they'll throw rose water on the ground, or, you know.
I always got the sense that I was sort of in a world of slow motion. Things were kind of like floated along. But another thing that no one ever writes about when you read about Afghanistan these days was there was an innate sense of humor. People were funny. They saw a lot of the absurdities that sort of surrounded them and make light of them, and they had a, I wouldn't say carefree, but they had a very nice view of life.
Surely you know then Mullah Nasruddin, the um, comic, wise fool of Oriental folklore, which is Nasruddin. Someone will always tell you in Afghanistan, it's not like Nasruddin did this or Nasruddin, did that. And he's always with his donkey, his long suffering donkey. And I'm speaking from Casablanca in Morocco, and they have Nasruddin, but they call him Joha. And they have no idea in Morocco that the same stories are told, thousands of miles.
Way.
Yeah, but and you're right. It's the humor. It's almost that even when I've sometimes been in very serious circumstances in Afghanistan when it's been very dangerous, and I'm sure you have too, and suddenly everyone breaks into laughter. Maybe because we're all about to be shot or whatever, but there's that. You're right. You're absolutely right. There's that, irresistible humor and delight.
A way to deal with what they often thought was the absurdity of things, that the places you could find yourself, the reaction would not be so much fear, but there would be that sort of giggling and smiling about the situation in which you have found yourself. And
Yeah, I can just hear ringing in my ears a fixer we had when I was there 20 years ago making a documentary, and we were in Mazar Sharif, and everything was going crazy, and we had mules to put our equipment on, and the mules had run away, and someone was shooting at us and stuff like that. And our fixer, Yama, just shouted. He hardly spoke any English, but in perfect English, he shouted, "This is Afghanistan." And it always rings in my ears. Yama
yeah,
shouting, "This is Afghanistan."
yeah, that's also the sort of the wildness. There was a wildness that was there as well, that would be, sort of this wanton life, living on the edge. They sort of knew it and made light of it and
Living
found
on
it
the
very
edge.
exciting.
Exactly. And what about the Afghanistan of, 2026? Do you find that you try to keep in the loop with what's going on?
I do. I was there for 8 years, in and out a lot. I left in 78, well, actually 7 years. I left in 78 in April after the Sour Revolution, as it was known. I left a couple days after that. And then Afghanistan sort of fell into a black hole for me. I was back in New York. My Indian business fell apart. And I remember someone said to me, there was very little media. I followed the war. I got the few books that were being published about the Mahajid, about the Soviet war and what was going on and keeping track of that. But then someone told me there was this thing called Google Earth. Eric Schmidt from Google introduced me to the beta thing of Google
Mhm.
Earth, and I found I could go into Afghanistan on my computer and dial down and see the streets where I used to live and be, and I would go everywhere. I found this fascinating, and soon thereafter, I met our friend Saad Hosseini. I was working as an executive in New York in the media business, and he came to see me, and he was told I was told he was the Rupert Murdoch of Afghanistan.
Did he tell you that?
No, his girlfriend, who had tracked me down in New York, said, "Well, you have to meet my boyfriend. He's the Rupert Murdoch of Afghanistan." At which point, I just spit up my Pellegrino water, and soon he arrived and told me he had started the first private TV and radio station in the country, and they needed help. And ultimately, I would go back there in 2007. So, 30 years after I had left, and I was fascinated to see what I would find. I mean, the war was going on, and I worked for 12 years with his media company as an advisor on the board. I would mentor people there, so I was in and out of Afghanistan for all that period of time, and it was quite a change from obviously the Afghanistan I knew. I felt like we have a character here in the States we call Rip Van Winkle,
Yeah, of course.
who's a guy who fell asleep for 20 years and he wakes up and the whole world has changed. I was sort of like Rip Van Winkle in Afghanistan.
But right, I think your timing is impeccable because right there again, you were in Afghanistan, early 2000s when there was another kind of fragment of time where it was still dangerous because I was there a lot then too, and God help me, sometimes it was indescribably dangerous, but it was not as it wasn't the Taliban time which we've had
It
before.
was a heady time. Kabul had grown to like be around 5 million people and clouded under pollution, but still it had this vibrancy that sort of the future was coming and better times were coming. And I did not know enough that a lot of it was sort of a mirage, but I would say that despite the fact that America spent $1 trillion and got nothing in return, the work that we did in the independent media sector did more to change attitudes and connect Afghans to each other, to connect Afghans to the outside world for the first time. Did a large, I wouldn't use the word civilized, but to sort of modernize the country. And, you would see women in school who could ultimately become parliamentarians or lawyers. I mean, it was a very heady time, obviously with an insurgency raging, but there was optimism for quite a while that
Well,
the corner had been turned and the dark forces had been sort of repelled, but that was an illusion.
I, but Tom, what I would say to that is that because of the work you did and Saad did and Tolo TV and Moby Media and other kind of initiatives, that put in place an infrastructure and a mindset that couldn't just be, torn down like a brick wall. And I talk with women every day, pretty much at the moment, all over Afghanistan, and they are on smartphones, which
Right.
that technology is only there because of the work that you were all doing. Because, I mean, the way I see it, it created a need and it kind of primed the waters, as it were, for this time when it would really be needed. So, what we're obsessed with at Sherazad Foundation is, this initiative we've started called Azada Women, which is very simple. All it's doing is providing free internet to women so they can access the kind of media that you and our mutual friend Saad and others were putting in place and have put in place, as well as courses on languages, on culture, on cookery, on anything. And what blows me away is how clued up young women are in Afghanistan. I was talking to someone yesterday, won't say her name or where she was, but she was in one of the major cities, but not in Kabul. And we started talking about Jamie Oliver, who's a British chef, and she was talking about a recipe that he was suggesting, and I loved that because it meant that she had the entire world,
I mean, essentially, despite the oppression and being squeezed out of the public sector, they're world citizens. They're plugged into what's going on. They have a curiosity that is sort of never ending, and they can connect anywhere, even though they're locked in their homes in many ways. So
exactly.
it's basically liberating, despite the oppression that they have to face on the outside. And one has to wonder, you know, how does that play out in 10 to 20 years? And is the iron hand of the Taliban going to be capable of sustaining itself in this repressive way? And the optimistic part of me says no, it's too much against the human spirit of the time that you're going to be able to keep people in a box like that.
Exactly. I mean, it's exactly what I've always felt. I'm a student of international relations and fascinated with situations, particularly in the 20th century, when, for example, what's jumping into my head, Cambodia, Pol Pot. Um, and I'm guessing you may have well been there as well, that it burnt out. It was like a wildfire. You can keep that sort of thing going for some time, but not all the time, because something else will come along. And thankfully, the people in Afghanistan, from my sense, are just, they're too clever and too street smart to kind of, you know, to pack up and give it all in.
And their culture was a vibrant culture in terms of the arts, in terms of music and poetry and literature, and it just can't be tamped down in a way that the Taliban would like to do. I don't think that it's just like this force that is undying. So it's going to be interesting to watch. And I gather that there are factions within the Taliban. So it says, well, there's the liberal branch of the Taliban. And then there's that more hardcore Kandahar-based, group. I would say that, the liberal branch probably is the more ascendant one, and maybe that's going to splinter, and the monopoly that they have on force might fall away. I don't know. It's hard to imagine it continuing the way it has. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia, which also had a regime very much with the
Mm.
oppression of females and so forth. Now they've got, roller coaster rides and movies, and women can drive, and women are in the public space. I mean, it's those are hard forces to constrain for personal liberation.
You're
I
right.
hope
And
Afghanistan.
our sense with Afghanistan is that maybe just like COVID was a time when, American people all learned, not all of them, but a lot of them learned Welsh and Gaelic, and they spent their time, yeah, watching stupid videos of cats climbing trees, but they also spent their time biding their time well and spending their time learning and spending, this lockdown. And I see this time for Afghan women and girls is kind of like a lockdown with, a hell of a lot worse, obviously. But given internet, given the ability to do stuff, to learn, then it becomes a learning zone and not a prison cell.
Yeah, they're regrouping. I mean, at one point, say you could have been a functioning lawyer or a parliamentarian or a judge or whatever, or a teacher, and then you're locked in your house. I mean, you've got to reorient and regroup and figure things out. And now we see that there's all this learning that's possible online. There's the internet, which is like this, river of information that's flowing through, and they're going to tap into it, and they will reemerge in a different way.
Hopefully stronger and free.
Yeah.
Tom Freston, thank you so, so much for your time and your insight and your own history of Afghanistan. Thank you. It
Well,
means
I
it
only
means
hope for the
everything.
best. That the people have been long suffering for 40 plus years now. And hopefully it changes in the wind, Tahir. And God bless the work that you're doing there.
Thank you.